This is Inform Your Resistance with Political Research Associates, or PRA. Tune in monthly to hear experts, researchers, journalists, academics, and movement strategists explain some of the most significant contemporary threats to democracy from the mainstream and far right. With Inform Your Resistance, we distill what you need to know most. I'm your host, Koki Mendes, Communications Director here at PRA. Today, I sat down with PRA Principal Research Advisor Steven Gardiner for his timely analysis on the attack on Venezuela, its implications for the MAGA base, and for the Trump administration's consolidating power. We also discussed the ongoing situation unfolding in Minneapolis, how organizers on the ground can prepare for confrontations with ICE, how the movement can maintain nonviolence by coupling on-the-ground mobilizations with other influential modes of resistance, and what we should be prepared for in terms of right-wing agitation at anti-ICE protests and repressive retaliation from the state. We recorded this interview on January 15th, 2026. Steven, pleasure as always talking with you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Great to be on again, Koki.
So we're going to get right into it today. We're going to talk a little bit about the attack on Venezuela that happened at the beginning of January and its implications for the Trump administration and related far-right agendas. And then we're going to transition in the second half of this episode to talking about ICE today, given all the very recent developments and the particular relevancy of anti-ICE mobilizations and our audience's work. So starting with Venezuela, what does the attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, taken seemingly unilaterally by the Trump administration, by the Trump cabinet, signal about the evolution of U.S. democratic structures in his second term?
Well, in some ways, it's an absolutely ordinary bit of U.S. imperialism along the trend line of concentrating power for foreign policy and military action overseas in the office of the president. Congress historically has not been very happy about this, even when it was the president's own party that was in a majority. In this case, though, we have an extension of that to the point where Congress was not even notified before the fact. So that's one. Two, this was a masterfully planned and executed military action that has no cogent reason for having been done, not even in standard sort of imperialist, colonialist understandings of the world, except for maybe one that actually comes out of it. And in fact, what there are is 4 different justifications coming from different parts of the White House infrastructure, and depending on who is, so these are 4 different reasons for doing this, none of which add up and none of which are actually happening. So the first one is the goal of regime change. Well, Maduro was not a charismatic leader. Taking him out of the picture does not change the regime. And the person pushing for this is Marco Rubio of Cuban descent and with a sort of a lifelong animus towards the current Cuban regime, wants to change it. And Venezuela, being a primary ally of Cuba in the region, would like to undermine Venezuela and get them to stop supporting Cuba. So that's one. There's Rubio's point. Most of the other people don't care about that very much. There's Stephen Miller, who wants to be able to escalate the belligerence in the world and potentially be able to say we're at war or in a warlike situation with Venezuela or otherwise in order to invoke the Alien Enemies Act and use it to deport people with even less due process. Again, this doesn't actually seem to be happening, but it's certainly being teased. And then we have the oil. And this is the reason that Trump finds acceptable, that if we could just go and steal that, we would make a big profit, and somehow I personally could probably profit from it. And that is unrealistic. It's going to take tens, probably hundreds of billions of dollars. Oil companies are reluctant to get involved. And that's the reality, that however much oil there may be there, it's going to take 10 years probably for it to be profitable, according to the experts. Now, there is a way to profit by subsidizing more development by American companies and security and infrastructure in Venezuela, siphoning the money from American taxpayers and giving it to American corporations. And that is probably the only way that there's going to be big profits quickly from this. Now, the last reason has directly to do with democracy and showing that the United States is a belligerent power and you cannot mess with us. If we don't like you, we will come and kill you or kidnap you. And that is the piece that is truly corrosive to democracy. And that's the only one of these four that is actually happening, that is like for sure on the ground a reality and will continue to be. And that is the one that also runs roughshod over things like congressional oversight and review by the courts. And the idea that we're going to just kidnap a president of a foreign country and bring him for trial in the United States, well, not quite without precedent, but there's no guarantee that the incompetent Trump Justice Department will even be able to bring a successful case in American court. They may say, we don't have jurisdiction. You're going to have to send him elsewhere for trial, back to Venezuela or to International Criminal Court or someplace else. And of course, this would be a big spectacle thing for the Trump administration to say, see, liberal judges, even if they're ones he appointed, that we can't trust them. And basically, we don't need these damn courts anyway. So yeah, it's really the belligerence, brutality, and that's also the piece that is on the same playing field as what is happening in the United States domestically, in Minneapolis, previously in Chicago and DC and Los Angeles, and other places that just happen to be, in political opposition to the president, like the Maduro administration. Gratuitous threats then that may not be gratuitous against Mexico and Cuba and Greenland and apparently all of NATO. So, yes.
That's an important parallel between the belligerence inside U.S. borders and outside. And I have to say, it is so telling that one of the four stated reasons does not include concern over fentanyl trafficking through Venezuela, which is the sort of standard talking point from the administration to its MAGA audience, which is purely false.
Yeah, well, of course, there are some people in the Justice Department who would like to be able to make some fentanyl cases related to Venezuela, but the underlying reality, which is not really even contested, is that Venezuela is a negligible node for transshipment or production of fentanyl of any kind. And even with cocaine, a small-time player compared to, say, Colombia, and with fentanyl, China and Mexico being production and transshipment points. So this idea it's made up out of whole cloth. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that there can't be some brutality and spectacle. We've already seen that with the blatant murders of people claimed by the Trump administration to be drug traffickers in international waters in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And of course, there's no provision in U.S. law or international law for summary execution of drug traffickers, even if you could prove that's what they were, and there's no proof been offered of any kind. So basically, again, a demonstration that we don't care about due process. We care about spectacular brutality and intimidation.
This raises the question for me of how the attack on Venezuela, these shows of brutality, similar threats of intervention in Iran, an implication for potential intervention in Cuba. How does this resonate with the America First, the purportedly non-interventionist movement within the MAGA coalition?
Well, you would think it would cause a lot of consternation, a lot of conflict. In fact, it's been relatively minimal, and mostly the pushback has mostly been from people on the outside of the regime. Even among the base, initial polling seems to be that as long as we are quick, brutal, efficient, and state that our purpose is not something wishy-washy, supporting democracy or human rights, but grounded in theft, they're okay with it, the base. And then you have people like Steve Bannon, who is not real thrilled about the rhetoric around Iran. That's a can of worms. That's a quagmire. We don't really want to get involved in it. That sounds like Hillary Clinton, which is, from Bannon's point of view, the worst slur you could possibly offer. But even Bannon has been, well, this isn't war. This is effective action, referring to Venezuela. And this is how it's being framed in the MAGA-verse, that this is Donald Trump simply imposing his will in his quick and violent way, his testosterone-fueled way. I'm not just saying that to be like a critique or something. This is words that come out of their mouths. And it shows that a more robust American foreign policy, where the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, and the Americas are part of the necessary backyard, the Monroe/Donroe doctrine of this is ours, leave it alone. And that means anyone who disagrees with me, even if you're not from the outside. So that's the idea. Now, there's probably room for some development of some splitting down the line. You have a few people, Tucker Carlson, for example, who has said, wait, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing this? This could have big negative repercussions. And why should we do this thing that no one can really tell me why we're doing it? Of course, if the real reason, even if it's not quite thought out, is to show that we're willing to beat people up and kill them because we don't like what they're doing or they won't bend the knee, that's a reason. It's just a old school, like ancient world imperialist reason.
How does that show of hypermasculinity of, might makes right, the impunity to violate international and domestic law, what are the implications of those demonstrations to the 2026 midterm elections? How does that interact with electoral politics?
Well, it depends on how well the administration can sell that what it is doing works. This is always the attraction of fascistic or authoritarian forms, that some people believe that they're more efficient than democracy. If you give someone all the power and just let them decide and enforce with violence against anyone who dissents, that you'll get things done. Now, there's no actual evidence in the Trump administration that this is the case, nor not much of any evidence historically, apart from maybe a few societies that had already descended into brutal civil war. So I would say that this is a situation where this performative kind of hyper-masculinist might makes right, you kill one of ours, we'll kill all of you, way of framing politics will have some impact in the MAGAverse and maybe beyond, if people are feeling afraid, if people are feeling like the country is descending into chaos, and if Trump can sell it's not his fault, it's the fault of those who won't go along with what is right for America. Will this work? I think it depends on the secondary impacts of all of this chaotic activity on the economy, on the sort of the lives of people far from the places where it is most, where the violence is most acutely being enacted. Now, already Venezuela and the Caribbean are a lot closer in the mental makeup of many Americans than, say, Gaza or Somalia. But Minneapolis and Chicago are, of course, in the midst of us. And still, if you live even in downstate Illinois, there are plenty of folks who are out there saying, well, if people would just obey the law, this would not be a problem.
And the fact that these are progressive urban cores really helps create space between sort of the MAGA-verse rural base and locations of resistance. This is a perfect transition to talking about Minneapolis and Portland, Oregon, which also there were also ICE shootings this past week in Portland. Trump has just threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act, I believe today, in response to the heightened anti-ICE mobilizations in Minneapolis. How can and will the Trump administration exploit increased violent conflicts between ICE officers, immigrant defense efforts, and anti-ICE protesters?
Well, this is the kind of chaotic situation under which a government or an administration, a regime, and a movement that has said all along that we are too soft, We are letting people get away with being disloyal and in opposition and in other ways un-American. We're not enforcing our will on people the way that we need to. This is raw meat for them. This is the kind of situation they think they want. Now, I'm hopeful that they're wrong to want it, not just in the ethical way, but also in the political, because I think a majority of people are going to look at this and say, even if from the point of view of a disengaged centrist, if there is such a thing left, even if protesters are a little bit out of hand, the Trump administration is bringing this on themselves with unwise actions and prioritizing things that no one really wants. Even people who are big into immigration enforcement mostly want slowing of people coming to the country, not expensive and violent efforts to round people up based on what they look like, based on the color of their skin or their accent.
I think there's also an added component of ICE looking particularly incompetent and poorly trained in a country that really values the professionalized military, places a lot of emphasis on the military might of a country rooted in a very organized, uniformed, well-trained show of force. And you have ICE in essentially Walmart military cosplay outfits, wearing masks and failing to effectively control the situations that they engage in. How do you think that this is resonating with the Trump base, the ICE as incompetent, ICE as unprofessional?
Well, again, I think it's a mixed bag. I think this is a strong appeal to people who are at the margins of the MAGAverse, of people who are supporters because they prefer essentially any quote-unquote pro-business to the right, anti-queer administration to any democratic, slightly less to the right administration. For those people, looking at the incompetence is startling. It's been remarked more than once that most of us have had the experience of being in a traffic stop at one point or another by just a local cop and know that those guys walk up to your car. They don't step in front of it. They don't put their hands inside of the window of an unsecured car. They do everything to avoid that because they've been trained. You could get yourself hurt if you do that, and they don't want that. Compare that to an ICE agent yelling at someone to roll down their window, and then if they don't, in 6 seconds, breaking it with a hammer and reaching inside. Well, this is a recipe for, making people panic, getting them hurt or killed, which it is not that different than what Black and brown folk have been saying about the way policing works in their neighborhoods, but it's not what white people expect. And it's a shock to see it happening to white people apparently only because of their politics, because they are in political opposition to the Trump administration exercising their First Amendment rights to do things that are perfectly legal, that are being on the spot reinterpreted by ICE agents who are taking on a mantle of judge, jury, and executioner in a situation where they're being told, oh, you have complete immunity, which of course legally is not the case. But this is part of the point. Their incompetence is a feature, if you want to say this. The incompetence, of course, is a feature of poor leadership or brutalizing leadership, fascistic leadership, and lack of training. And so people who are looking at this and can see it are appalled, but many are like, this is the way policing should be done. We should be roughing people up who make any move to question the legitimacy of a federal law enforcement, quote unquote, officer or agent on the ground. Should not be done. Of course, this is completely contrary to the perfectly ordinary legal tradition as it is understood in most of the kinds of legal precedents that matter around First Amendment politically protected activities, which give wide leeway to citizens to oversee what agents of the state are doing unless those activities are happening in some classified space behind barbed wire. If it's out on the streets, it's public, and we have every right to observe it and to say we don't like it. And yelling is not obstructing, is not illegal.
So I think we can see a way in which, especially the most recent ICE actions, could potentially peel off more of the center of Trump's base, especially in the upcoming elections. This is a particularly fraught moment for continuing the resistance effort with heightened tensions, threats of insurrection act invocation. What advice do you have for the on-the-ground organizers who are defending their communities from ICE kidnappings, but also, importantly, organizing ongoing demonstrations? How can we effectively resist and still maintain a commitment to nonviolence? And what do you think organizers and people in the streets should be aware of in terms of the rights response and the opportunism in these moments?
So, yeah, people in Minneapolis are doing a wonderful job. The issue becomes this: escalation and fatigue and stress and trauma from seeing people being brutalized will over time erode people's ordinary capacity to cope and their decision making. So it's key to try to recruit more people into action so that people can rotate in and out and not have to be out there on the street every day being traumatized over and over again. It's important to recruit secondary and tertiary off-site support people who can provide, cleanup areas after people have been tear gassed, who can provide coffee and tea and hot chocolate and water, who can provide warm-up spaces in the brutal cold of the upper Midwest. It's important to be in conversation with those who are not directly involved to explain, no, this doesn't mean, to be clear, the vast majority of people who are involved with this are not in any kind of way professionals. They are ordinary citizens who are looking around and seeing their neighbors being treated and their neighborhoods being treated in a way they find fundamentally wrong. And they're going out to witness and to help and to voice, as is their right, their opposition to what is happening, which includes a direct voicing to the people who are doing it, saying, why aren't you ashamed? Well, people don't like being told that, but the fact that they don't like it is completely legally irrelevant. And so that's the first piece of the advice. We got to broaden the circle if we possibly can. 2, we got to think about how do we put more pressure on the people who have the biggest voices, the community leaders, the corporate leaders, the big institutional organizations, both locally but also nationally, politicians who are maybe saying, well, I'm going to file a lawsuit. Now, they're going to have to step into the fray and say, we are going to use every resource at our disposal to resist this short of actually engaging in armed conflict with the federal government. That may include, arrests of people or issuing of court orders, local court orders, or emergency injunctions, or setting up city resources for people who are protesting to help with their legal defense and help with their transportation and help with their detoxification after they're tear gassed, and providing local advice on neighborhoods to how to better seal their houses. We had reports of young children and infants who have had tear gas come into their house and had it create, breathing difficulties. And these are the kinds of things situation that people face in war zones. And this is not a war zone. Minneapolis is not yet being bombed, but it's not pretty. And so there's that. So part of the efforts have to be oriented not just towards protesting directly the people who apparently don't care. I think this was ICE's, if they had a motto change, I don't know if they actually have a motto now, but if they had a motto change, it should be, I don't care, or we don't care, to people who have bigger voices in Congress, in the governor's office, in the mayor's office, even though they are doing some things in Minnesota and other places. It's not enough. It's not enough. It shouldn't be only on the voters, on the people to take risks. And it's time for, and I'm talking about, the heads of not just a comradely minister who is stepping out, but religious institutions, not just, some local ACLU and NLG folks, but the American Bar Association. We are in a situation where we cannot treat this as if it is normal. Staying nonviolent is morally and tactically an imperative, but to do it means doing some of these other tactics that don't just involve putting your body in front of people who don't care if they kill you or not.
That's really helpful. The idea of practicing nonviolence also means being creative about where to funnel your energies so that you're not putting yourself constantly in a point of conflict, a physical confrontation. So how should organizers prepare for the response from ICE in these moments and from the federal administration? And do you have any concerns around disruptors taking advantage of mass mobilizations in already fraught confrontations?
Yes, I have deep concerns about the disruptors, about right-wing actors. The more successful the resistance actions are, and particularly the protest actions, the on-the-ground actions are fluid enough that they're harder for people to respond to. But protest actions tend to be more visible and to last longer, and historically they attract opposition. And that opposition can be organized, and it can also be individuals who've been mobilized ideologically, but who are not part of any group. And we already see some influencers on the ground who are intentionally provoking protesters by telling them just the most awful things about what has been done and the unworthiness of the people whom it has been done to, and really enraging things, attempting to provoke violence, to record it and put it online to try to mobilize others. Whenever a MAGA person is assaulted by or assaults a group of protesters, that if that's videoed, it tends to go quite viral in the MAGAverse. People love it, especially if the MAGA person is particularly violent and successful at their violence. This is great fun in the MAGAverse. And so there's that. So preparing for that means knowing who's at your protest, having people having de-escalators and interveners. De-escalators are there to keep our most volatile, but also most vulnerable away from the provocateurs. And interveners are people who are trained in being able to put their body in front of that person and look at them and say, yeah, say your stuff. We don't care. And then preparing for what's coming from the administration. Well, the more successful the resistance is, the more likely the administration is to escalate. And at this point, it's hard to see the kinds of ordinary political constraints that would go with an understanding that a major deployment of, say, the 82nd Airborne to Minneapolis because of people blowing whistles and honking horns is not going to be well received in most of the country. The idea is that they will further mobilize their base by acting in a way that is openly fascistic. We have the might. We can force you to do it. We don't have to take into consideration how we do it, its legality or constitutionality, its ethical meaning, or even the will of the majority of the people living in these places. We don't really care what these people think who live in Minneapolis, because Minneapolis leadership and by voting percentages is against us anyway. They need to be taught a lesson. So to prepare for that's a mental preparation, but it's also the other things that we talked about before, creating these secondary and tertiary support systems that can move people in and out, that can move people around if they're being targeted or doxed. Doxing is going to be a real worry for leadership, people who are speaking out and become identifiable. Our social sphere will be using every resource at their disposal to try to point animus at these people, particularly if they're if their jobs or if their home addresses are known or their jobs make them accessible. And so people need to be prepared for that. That means doing the cybersecurity work of scrubbing their locations and prearranging support, and think about funding for legal support if there are issues and people are accused of things that may or may not be remotely true. Lawsuits may be filed, and everything has to be documented in terms of the kinds of harassment that people may face, both from the federal government as well as from individuals who are there saying that they are supporting ICE and supporting the ICE heroes who are just trying to enforce American law by, sending a paramilitary army to an American city that happens to be in political opposition to the president. This is not the way American federalism is supposed to work. He's supposed to be the president of the whole country, not just the people who agree with him.
Well, that's certainly one note to end on. I think this was very useful to hear. I think your advice in particular is really practical and implementable for the organizers who are facing in Minneapolis and a situation newer for the city, but one that there's a lot of learning from Chicago available now too. And so I think your point too about networking, preparation, fundraising for legal support, these are all things that folks in major democratic cities, especially cities with large non-white populations, large immigrant populations, can look in advance to and prepare. I think you also have given us a lot of insight into the way that the MAGA base is responding both to what is happening on the ground with ICE and in Venezuela, and the ways in which there's opportunities for division, but also a lot of fluidity and flexibility across the base and an ability to hold a coalition together despite what should otherwise seem like pretty big sticking points, for instance, from the America First or the sort of conservative pro-business sector who is uncomfortable with chaos. And so I think we'll see in 2026, in the midterms, how the base holds together at the ballot. Thank you so much, Steven, for sitting down with me today. I hope that we have an opportunity to continue to do this as conditions unfurl on the ground.
Thank you, Koki. It was great to be here as always.
Thank you for listening to Inform Your Resistance with PRA. Today's episode was hosted by me, Koki Mendes. The podcast is produced by Olivia Lawrence Weilman. This episode was fact-checked by me. Jack Geesking created our show notes, and Frank Lawrence our music. If you haven't already, rate, review, and subscribe. If you appreciate our work, please consider donating to Political Research Associates at politicalresearch.org. And the best thing you can do to help us is tell your comrades about the pod. Resisting authoritarianism is better with friends. Until next time.